Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History Secrets, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight, we're setting our lanterns to mildly terrified as we explore one of history's favorite bedtime stories, the end of the world. Because if you think our era is anxious, wait until you hear about the Middle Ages, a time when people thought the apocalypse was not just coming, but running late. Back then, fear wasn't a niche hobby. It was a full-time job. Every drought, every sneeze, every oddly shaped cloud was interpreted as divine scheduling. A rooster crowing at the wrong hour? Clearly the Antichrist's alarm clock. And somewhere, a monk was already writing about it in perfect Latin. But let's set the scene. It's Europe, around the year 900. Castles are rare, plagues are common, and deodorant has yet to be invented. Nighttime is silent except for wolves, bells, and the occasional neighbor repenting loudly. The stars stretch endlessly above, glowing like ancient emails waiting to be read. In this dim, candlelit world, people lived close to death and closer to the church. The Bible wasn't just scripture, it was a cosmic countdown timer. Monks whispered about prophecies from Revelation, fire, famine, and 4 horsemen galloping somewhere out of frame. Artists painted judgment scenes so detailed you could almost hear the trumpets. And peasants, standing barefoot in muddy fields, looked up at the sky and thought, "Yeah, that checks out." Even the church seemed nervous. Priests warned that sin was stacking up faster than indulgence money could cancel it out. Some scholars began whispering about the year 1000, the big one, the one where Christ might return and do a bit of divine housekeeping. Spoiler, he didn't. But we'll get there. For now, picture the feeling. Waking up each morning unsure if breakfast is necessary because the world might not make it to lunch. And yet, people still plowed, still prayed, still argued about goats. Because even when the end feels near, humans have an incredible ability to keep scheduling things. Before we go deeper, a quick reminder from your favorite sleepy storyteller. If you enjoy historical doom sprinkled with cozy confusion, give this video a like. Not for me, but for the anxious medieval villager inside us all. And subscribe so you can join us each week as we turn existential terror into a lullaby. Now take a deep breath. Let the candlelight flicker softly in your imagination. Because tonight, we'll walk through centuries of panic, prophecy, and plagues. The long, hilarious tradition of thinking this time, for sure, the world was about to end. In the Middle Ages, the sky was basically the internet, vast, mysterious, and full of terrifying misinformation. People didn't just look up at it, they read it. Every light, streak, or celestial hiccup was a message, and humanity's inbox was permanently full. A blood-red moon, anger, a meteor shower, angels fighting overhead, a solar eclipse, the heavens unsubscribing from humanity altogether. Imagine being a shepherd, minding your sheep, when suddenly the sun disappears. Within seconds, everyone's screaming, confessing, and promising to never gossip about the blacksmith's wife again. Meanwhile, the sheep are just standing there, wondering why their dinner got canceled. The church didn't help much. Priests preached that these signs were warnings, cosmic press releases about sin. And since science wasn't a department yet, nobody could say otherwise. The world above was a mystery. The only thing certain was that it probably hated you. Chroniclers filled entire manuscripts describing fiery swords in the clouds, stars that danced like drunks, and halos around the moon that looked suspiciously like giant heavenly eyeballs. If a comet appeared, everyone assumed it was either the apocalypse or a royal baby announcement gone wrong. One famous event happened in 1066. Yes, the year of the Norman conquest. Before William the Conqueror crossed the English Channel, people saw a blazing comet stretch across the night sky. They panicked, naturally. To them, it wasn't astronomy. It was a celestial tweet that read, "Brace yourselves." Turns out, they were right to worry. A few months later, England got invaded, and so for generations, the heavens became a source of both beauty and existential dread. Poets called the stars the lamps of God, while peasants thought of them more as the warning lights of doom. Still, it's oddly comforting, isn't it? Even in their fear, medieval people looked up. They searched for meaning in the vast unknown, the same way we scroll for it now. So as you lie back and picture those old skies, wide, dark, whispering with mystery, remember, every time they saw a shooting star, they didn't make a wish. They made a will. Ah, yes, the original Y2K panic. Except this one didn't involve computers, just monks, candles, and an alarming overconfidence in Roman numerals. As the first millennium approached, whispers spread across Europe. The year 1000 was coming. The big one, the apocalyptic deadline everyone had been quietly panicking about since, well, forever. You see, medieval theologians loved numbers. They believed God was basically a cosmic accountant, and history followed a perfect numerical plan. 6 days of creation meant 6,000 years of world history, give or take. And since they'd roughly calculated Earth's birthday as around 4000 BC, well, you can do the math. Actually, you can't. They couldn't either. Numbers were hard. Monks hunched over parchment, trying to line up the years with Bible verses, comets, and the occasional pig with extra legs. Some declared that Christ would return exactly 1,000 years after his birth. Others argued that maybe it was 1,000 years after his death. Either way, everyone agreed. The clock was ticking. Villages began preparing for doomsday the medieval way, by confessing, fasting, and occasionally selling all their possessions to monks who promised priority seating in heaven. Kings built extra chapels, nobles funded monasteries, and peasants repented for sins they weren't even sure existed. "Forgive me, Father, for I have eaten an extra onion." As the year 999 bled into 1000, the atmosphere was electric. Bells rang louder, churches filled. Night skies were watched with trembling eyes. Some people even camped out in graveyards, convinced the dead were about to rise for roll call. And then, nothing happened. The world didn't burn. Angels didn't descend. Trumpets stayed mercifully silent. The cows mooed, the roosters crowed, and somewhere a monk had to awkwardly update his manuscript from final judgment to minor accounting error. The aftermath was equally human. Some celebrated, others sighed in disappointment. A few true believers simply adjusted the date and said, "Next year for sure." It was history's first example of moving the goalposts. But something important happened that night. People learned that the world could almost end and then carry on. They learned that apocalypse was less of a deadline and more of a hobby. And so, from that moment on, Europe settled into a new rhythm. Equal parts faith, fear, and the quiet suspicion that someone, somewhere, had misplaced the divine calendar. Now that the world had survived the first millennium, you might think people relaxed. They didn't. They just got creative. In medieval Europe, everything, and I mean everything, could be interpreted as a sign from heaven. A cow gives birth to twins? End times. A fish found with 2 heads? End times. Your neighbor sneezes 3 times before breakfast? Absolutely, definitely the apocalypse. The line between miracle and omen was paper thin and usually determined by whoever owned the loudest church bell. Chroniclers wrote pages describing monstrous births, blood-red rain, and rivers that mysteriously changed direction, all taken as divine warnings that humanity was on thin ice with the Almighty. And it wasn't just nature acting weird. Even baked goods got involved. One medieval account claims that when a loaf of bread fell crust first to the ground, people took it as a sign of cosmic disapproval. Another described a chicken that crowed backwards, which frankly is impressive even without the theology. Behind these strange interpretations was a kind of fragile logic. Life back then was unpredictable. Floods, famine, and plague came without warning, so people looked for patterns, for reasons, for any hint that someone, anyone, was in charge of the chaos. If you found a snake curled up near your doorstep, it wasn't biology. It was a celestial text message. And the church, ever the spiritual customer service desk, offered explanations. Omens, they said, were reminders to repent. Signs to stay humble. Proof that the end might not be today, but it was definitely penciled in. But fear has a way of becoming entertainment. Soon, portents became gossip. The medieval version of tabloids. Peasants swapped stories of monstrous fish and flaming skies while drinking ale, nodding sagely about how doomed everyone was. And the next morning, they went back to their fields, comforted that at least they had seen it coming. It's oddly relatable, isn't it? Even now we scroll through bad news, convinced the end is near, and then quietly continue microwaving our leftovers. We've been like this for 1,000 years, anxious, imaginative, and somehow still scheduling things for next week. So as you close your eyes, imagine a quiet medieval village under a starry sky. Somewhere, a rooster crows at midnight, a candle flickers, and someone whispers, "It's a sign." And it is. Just not the one they think. It's the sign that life, no matter how scared we get, keeps calmly, absurdly, beautifully going on. In the Middle Ages, the church wasn't just a place to pray. It was the world's first subscription service. For a modest fee, or a generous land donation, you could shorten your stay in purgatory, guarantee blessings for your goats, and, if business was slow, maybe even help prevent the apocalypse. Fear, you see, was profitable. Medieval preachers loved a good fire and brimstone sermon. They'd describe the Last Judgment in vivid detail. Oceans boiling, angels blowing trumpets, demons doing whatever demons do when unsupervised. Parishioners would sit trembling, clutching their rosaries, silently calculating how many sins could be undone before supper. And it worked. Donations poured in. Cathedrals rose like stone prayers to heaven. Funded by the terrified generosity of people who genuinely thought the world might end before the roof was finished. Every fresco, every gilded altar, every tower scraping the clouds whispered the same thing. "Please notice us, God." Monks copied Revelation onto parchment with the precision of accountants filling out an eternal tax return. Each page glowed with images of fiery beasts, angelic armies, and people regretting absolutely everything. The apocalypse wasn't just a prophecy, it was marketing. Of course, not everyone believed the hype. Some scholars quietly pointed out that the world seemed to be doing fine, aside from the plagues, wars, and absence of indoor plumbing. But in a world where crops failed and the night sky looked suspiciously judgmental, optimism wasn't fashionable. The church leaned into this anxiety. It wasn't cruelty, it was strategy. A frightened flock is a faithful flock. And so every sermon, every candle, every holy relic reminded believers that the end was coming, soonish. And maybe, just maybe, if you behaved, you could skip the fire part. Yet beneath all the fear, there was comfort. The church offered structure, a cosmic to-do list. Confess, pray, donate, repeat. In a chaotic world, that rhythm made sense. It gave people something to do while waiting for the inevitable. And that's the quiet irony of it all. The institution that terrified millions also gave them hope, that their small, candlelit lives mattered in the grand story of salvation. That even if the world ended tomorrow, their little prayers would still echo through the ruins. So, as you imagine those vast cathedrals filled with flickering candles and trembling hearts, remember, sometimes the best way to manage chaos is to organize it, preferably with a collection plate. If there was ever a moment when people really thought the apocalypse had arrived, it was during the Black Death. Picture Europe in the mid-1300s. Quiet streets, shuttered windows, and an invisible terror moving faster than gossip in a monastery. Within a few short years, 1/3 of the continent was gone. Whole towns vanished, markets silent, and even graveyards too full to keep up. The world didn't just feel like it was ending, it smelled like it. Doctors, those lucky enough to survive long enough to diagnose anything, wore beaked masks stuffed with herbs, looking like plague-themed bird mascots. They didn't understand infection, but they did understand drama. Priests carried incense through the streets, waving it like divine bug spray, and people prayed harder than ever, not just for salvation, but for an explanation. Surely this was it, the final trumpet. God's last patience stretched thin. Chronicles from the time read like horror diaries, fiery comets, black boils, rivers turning red, cats accused of witchcraft. Everyone searched for someone to blame, the sinful, the foreign, the unlucky. Flagellants, men and women convinced pain would earn forgiveness, marched through towns whipping themselves in rhythm to hymns. It was equal parts repentance and performance art. Villagers watched them pass, half awed, half horrified, and entirely convinced that the apocalypse was on tour. And yet, amid all the fear and loss, something remarkable happened. People adapted. Gravediggers sang while they worked. Merchants quietly reopened shops. Farmers planted new crops over forgotten fields. Even when death filled the air, life, stubborn, ordinary life, refused to stop breathing. Art changed too. Painters filled church walls with skeletons dancing among the living, the dance of death. Not as horror, but as reminder that all are equal in the end. Kings, peasants, bakers, and monks, one long conga line to eternity. It sounds grim, but it was strangely comforting. If the world was ending, at least everyone was invited. And when the plague finally receded, something subtle shifted in Europe's soul. People realized the apocalypse could come and go, leaving the world messy but still turning. They stopped expecting the heavens to collapse and started wondering what they could build here in the meantime. The world had ended, and yet it hadn't. It simply rolled forward, quieter, wiser, a little more aware that life, no matter how fragile, always sneaks back in. So close your eyes now and imagine it. The silent towns, the tolling bells, the soft dawn after the darkest night. Even when everyone thought it was over, it was really just another beginning. If you lived in the Middle Ages, you didn't need Netflix. You had the unseen world. Every breeze, creak, and misplaced spoon could be blamed on something supernatural, and often was. The universe was crowded, angels hovering politely above, demons lurking enthusiastically below, and humanity wobbling nervously in between, like the world's least confident sandwich filling. People genuinely believed they shared their homes with invisible company. You prayed not only for protection from evil, but also for patience with the spiritual roommates who occasionally rearranged your cutlery. Angels weren't the chubby babies of Renaissance art yet. They were warriors, messengers, and sometimes terrifying multi-winged wheels of fire. The Bible described them, and medieval artists enthusiastically illustrated them, producing creatures that looked like celestial wind turbines with opinions. Demons, on the other hand, were everywhere. They lurked in the corners of taverns, inside cheese that had gone off, and sometimes, allegedly, inside the neighbor's cat. Medieval manuals even advised priests on how to spot demonic possession. Signs included sudden strength, strange languages, or an unnatural dislike of holy water. To be fair, nobody likes being sprayed mid-conversation. But there was structure to this madness. The church built an entire spiritual bureaucracy, choirs of angels, ranks of demons, hierarchies of holiness. Heaven ran like a well-managed kingdom. Hell, like a startup with no HR department. For the average medieval person, this invisible ecosystem was oddly comforting. It meant the chaos around them had meaning. Every misfortune was part of a cosmic drama, starring them briefly as concerned peasant number 3. So they prayed, they crossed themselves, they hung protective charms on doors. At night, families recited blessings to keep demons out, and maybe angels in. Fear, yes, but also faith. Because to believe in angels and demons is to believe the universe notices you, that your small life, your flickering candle, your whispered prayer, mattered in the endless tug-of-war between light and dark. So, as you settle under your blanket, imagine them now, luminous beings watching over quiet villages, shadows slipping through moonlight, both sides of eternity keeping the medieval world deliciously uneasy. And in that unease, somehow, comfort. Before there was The Exorcist or Game of Thrones, there was the Book of Revelation. It had everything. Dragons, beasts, plagues, fire, trumpets, cosmic battles, and more fan theories than a Reddit thread. Medieval Europe read it like a prophecy and illustrated it like a fever dream. Scribes spent years copying its verses by hand, decorating each page with gold, crimson, and existential dread. Monks drew angels with swords, seas turning to blood, and the 4 horsemen galloping dramatically across the margins. Imagine trying to fall asleep after illuminating that all day. To ordinary believers, Revelation wasn't just literature. It was a news forecast. Every famine, every earthquake, every sneeze that sounded suspiciously apocalyptic was slotted neatly into John's vision of the end. Villagers genuinely believed they were living in chapter 12, paragraph 3. And who could blame them? Life in the Middle Ages already felt like Revelation's rehearsal. There were wars, pestilence, strange skies, and frankly, not enough soap. Preachers quoted Revelation like motivational speakers for the terrified. They promised the faithful would be saved when the world burned, which was comforting if you didn't mind the fire part. Artists, meanwhile, leaned into the drama, painting demons with teeth like farm equipment and angels with enough wings to generate lift. But the secret of Revelation's power wasn't in its terror. It was in its poetry. The world ending wasn't the point. Renewal was. A new heaven, a new earth. Hope rising from ashes like the medieval version of a sequel nobody asked for, but everyone needed. Even peasants, illiterate and exhausted, understood that promise. When they heard about the final judgment, they didn't just imagine doom, they imagined justice. A cosmic reset button where the rich, the cruel, and the guy who overcharged for firewood all finally got their comeuppance. So yes, Revelation was scary. But it was also strangely soothing. It told people their suffering had purpose. That behind the thunder and monsters, someone was keeping score. And that mercy might still have the final word. Picture a candlelit chapel, the air thick with incense, a monk reading those fiery verses aloud while snow falls outside. The world may end tomorrow. But for now, there's warmth, rhythm, and the quiet comfort of knowing that even the apocalypse can be beautifully written. If you ever need proof that medieval people believed the world was ending, just look at their weather reports. In the 14th century, Europe hit what historians politely call the Little Ice Age. Translation: it was cold, wet, and everyone was out of snacks. Crops failed, livestock died, and peasants stared resentfully at the sky like it was an unreliable landlord. Spring came late, summers turned to mud, and winters showed up early and refused to leave. If climate change existed then, it was in reverse. Entire communities starved, rivers flooded, washing away grain, homes, and optimism. When the fields didn't yield, people did what humans always do. They tried to explain it. Was it sin? Was it witches? Was it the French? Probably all three, depending on who you asked. Chroniclers described years without bread, when desperate villagers boiled bark and grass for soup. Others roasted whatever moved, frogs, rats, or, in truly dark times, something less mentionable. And in church, priests reminded them that famine was divine discipline, the heavenly version of a timeout. But here's the fascinating thing. Even in the midst of catastrophe, medieval people didn't give up. They held processions in the rain, prayed for mercy, and sometimes blamed the wrong neighbor. But they kept going. They believed suffering was temporary, even if temporary had lasted their entire lives. In some places, miracle stories appeared like spiritual weather forecasts. A saint's statue crying, a vision in the clouds, a loaf of bread that mysteriously refused to run out. Anything to remind them that God hadn't completely ghosted humanity. Famine wasn't just hunger, it was theology made visible. When crops failed, people saw the wrath of heaven. When they grew again, it was proof of forgiveness. The world ended every winter and began again every spring. And maybe that's why, through it all, they never stopped planting. Because even the hungriest peasant knew that tomorrow, if it ever came, would still need bread. Now, if famine and plague weren't terrifying enough, the medieval sky liked to add special effects. Enter the comet, a streak of fire across the heavens. bright, beautiful, and guaranteed to ruin everyone's evening. To medieval eyes, comets weren't harmless space rocks. They were celestial daggers, burning messages from God's inbox marked urgent. Whenever one appeared, you could practically hear the collective gasp echo across Europe. Kings summoned astrologers, priests rang bells, peasants packed repentance into overdrive. Because obviously, if the sky is on fire, something terrible is about to happen. Probably taxes. One chronicler wrote that comets signify great deaths of men, the fall of kingdoms, and the wrath of the Lord. That's one way to say pretty lights. In 1347, a particularly bright comet blazed over Europe, a glittering sword in the sky. Within months, the Black Death began its march across the continent. Coincidence? To them, absolutely not. To modern science? Mostly, yes. To the medieval imagination? Definitive proof that heaven was subtweeting humanity. Monks described the comet as a dragon breathing flame, a sword above the world, and a heavenly torch of sorrow. People held vigils through the night, eyes fixed upward, waiting for either angels or judgment, whichever RSVP'd first. Even after it faded, its memory burned on. For decades, artists painted comets into their apocalypse scenes, as if every disaster needed one for dramatic lighting. And in a way, it did. But there's beauty in the fear, too. Imagine it. A quiet medieval field, cold wind brushing through wheat stubble, and above it a silent, burning arc of light. No one understands it, but everyone feels it. The awe, the smallness, the ancient certainty that the universe is watching. They didn't know about orbits or gases or gravitational math. They just knew that sometimes the sky caught fire, and for one brief, luminous moment, the heavens looked alive. So as you drift off tonight, picture that comet streaking across the dark, not as a warning, but as a whisper. A reminder that even when the world feels like it's ending, it's still astonishingly beautiful. If you've ever wondered what it was like to live before social media, the answer is surprisingly similar. Medieval Europe was full of influencers. They just didn't have ring lights. They were prophets, visionaries, wandering preachers, and self-declared messengers of God. Their niche? The apocalypse. Every few years, someone new would pop up claiming the end of the world was scheduled for next Thursday. They gathered crowds, delivered sermons, and occasionally levitated or claimed to. It was the medieval version of going viral. Some were sincere, others were scammers, and a few were just very bad at math. One prophet in France declared that Christ would return after a comet, an earthquake, and a particularly large goose migration. Another claimed to have spoken directly with the archangel Michael through a dream involving cabbage soup, and people believed them. Because honestly, what else were they going to do? There was no news, no weather channel, and the only trending topic was sin. These doomsday influencers weren't all lunatics, though. Some were clever, even compassionate. They traveled from town to town preaching repentance, urging people to forgive one another, feed the poor, and stop stealing their neighbors' chickens, just in case Judgment Day had good record-keeping. But not all apocalyptic PR was peaceful. Certain prophets gained so much influence that authorities grew nervous. Peasants left their fields, nobles skipped council meetings, and everyone waited for the sky to fall instead of paying taxes. The church, of course, couldn't let random people steal the spotlight. So they issued guidelines. If your prophecy didn't align with official theology, congratulations. You are now a heretic, and possibly flammable. Still, these wandering preachers served a purpose. They gave people something to believe in when the world seemed unpredictable. They were human mirrors, reflecting both fear and hope. Proof that, even in chaos, someone was trying to make sense of it all. So the next time you scroll past a modern doomsday tweet, remember, you're part of a 1,000-year-old tradition. Humanity's oldest influencer campaign, "The End is Near," sponsored by anxiety. If prophets were the talk show hosts of medieval fear, astrologers were the data analysts. They didn't predict the apocalypse through dreams. They used charts, math, and an impressive amount of confidence. To medieval thinkers, the heavens were a divine spreadsheet. Every star had meaning. Every planet had mood swings. When Mars moved into alignment with Saturn, it wasn't just astronomy. It was destiny filing a complaint. Kings, popes, and peasants alike believed the stars could forecast everything. Crops, wars, plagues, and, of course, the grand finale of existence. Astrologers became celebrities, draped in robes and arrogance, peering at the night sky like accountants of fate. One famous prediction in 1524, a little late but very on brand, claimed that a massive planetary alignment would cause a world-ending flood. Panic spread across Europe. People built arks, moved to mountaintops, and stocked up on dried fish. When the date arrived, it rained. A little, somewhere in Germany. But by then, the astrologers had already updated their charts and declared they had misread a star or two. Classic rebranding. Still, astrology wasn't just fear-mongering. It was comfort disguised as math. In a world where so much was random, storms, wars, diseases, birth, death, it felt good to think someone, somewhere, had written it all down in the sky. That your fate wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Even the church, despite side-eyeing astrology, occasionally peeked at horoscopes when convenient. Popes consulted star charts for coronations. Nobles planned weddings under favorable constellations, and ordinary people looked at the night sky, searching for their own tiny horoscope of hope. It's easy to laugh at it now. The charts, the omens, the endless excuses when predictions failed. But look at us. We still check daily horoscopes to see if we should text our ex. We still want to believe that the universe is paying attention. Maybe medieval people weren't wrong, just poetic. They looked at the same stars we see tonight and thought, there must be meaning up there. So as you drift off, picture the old astrologer, quill in hand, candle flickering. Outside, the sky stretches endlessly, full of constellations that whisper not doom, but wonder. Because maybe the stars aren't telling us the end. Maybe they're just reminding us that we're part of something infinite. You'd think knights had enough to worry about. Swords, dragons, surprise jousts. But even behind castle walls, apocalypse anxiety thrived. For all their armor and glory, knights were some of the most paranoid people in Europe. They fought wars that never seemed to end, served kings who changed sides faster than a chess match, and confessed sins so regularly you'd think they had a loyalty card for it. Every battle felt like Judgment Day. Every trumpet could be the trumpet. When knights rode into war, they believed they were fighting for eternal salvation, not just land. Some carried relics into battle, Saint bones, crosses, or little parchment prayers stuffed into armor plates, because nothing says faith like divine chainmail. And if they died, well, at least they'd look dramatic doing it. Castles, too, were monuments to both strength and fear. Their thick walls were built as much against armies as against divine uncertainty. Behind those stone fortresses, life was routine but restless. Endless feasts, whispered confessions, and lots of talk about whether the world outside was falling apart again. Imagine sitting by a roaring fire, surrounded by tapestries depicting monsters, while outside a storm howls and lightning flashes. The drawbridge creaks, thunder booms, and someone mutters, "It's a sign." Even nobles weren't immune to guilt. With so much wealth and privilege, they worried they'd be first in line for divine judgment. So to balance things out, they built chapels, sponsored monasteries, and paid monks to pray for their souls. Essentially, a medieval subscription to afterlife insurance. And yet, amidst all that anxiety, knights and lords still found time to laugh, feast, and flirt. Because when the world might end tomorrow, why not have an extra goblet of wine tonight? They toasted to courage, honor, and sometimes the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, the apocalypse would take a rain check. So if you ever picture medieval life as fearless and heroic, remember, even the bravest knight sometimes stared into the fire and thought, "What if this is it?" And then poured himself another drink, just in case. For the average peasant, the apocalypse wasn't an event. It was a lifestyle. Every day brought something vaguely disastrous. One week, the crops failed. The next, a neighbor's cow gave birth to something with too many legs. And when lightning struck the church steeple, everyone agreed. Yep, that's the beginning. People didn't need priests to tell them the world was fragile. They lived it. Hunger, plague, war, and taxes made life feel like a series of divine experiments. You woke up, crossed yourself, hoped your roof wouldn't leak, and tried not to anger God before breakfast. Medieval calendars were littered with holy days, feasts, fasts, saint celebrations, each one both joyful and quietly nervous. The logic was simple. If the end is near, it's best to stay on good terms with heaven. It was spiritual multitasking, farming, praying, repenting, repeating. Even small things took on cosmic meaning. If your bread didn't rise, maybe the devil sneezed in the dough. If a black cat crossed your path, you whispered a prayer just in case. If the local well bubbled strangely, congratulations. The Antichrist was probably involved. And yet, despite the constant dread, life went on with surprising cheer. Villages held festivals, marriages, and markets. Children chased chickens. Women gossiped over washing lines, and old men debated theology between mugs of ale. Because even when you think the end is coming, there's still laundry to do. Peasants found comfort in community. When the priest warned about Judgment Day, they nodded politely, then asked if the church roof would be fixed before it rained again. The apocalypse was a far-off idea. The leaking thatch was a now problem. There's a kind of peace in that simplicity, living as though every day might be your last, but still remembering to milk the cow. So as you imagine that small village, smoke rising from chimneys, church bells echoing across the fields, remember that for them, the end of the world wasn't terrifying. It was just Tuesday. Before Netflix documentaries about serial killers, medieval Europe had bestiaries, lavishly illustrated books full of animals that were half biology, half hallucination, and entirely symbolic. These weren't just creature catalogs. They were moral instruction manuals. Every beast meant something. The lion represented Christ. The snake symbolized the devil. The unicorn, purity and also wishful thinking. And then there were the more experimental entries. Men with dog heads, fish with human faces, and a chicken that supposedly breathed fire. History's first rotisserie. To the medieval mind, monsters weren't fantasy. They were warnings, divine parables wrapped in bad zoology. If sailors reported a whale the size of a cathedral, scholars didn't ask for proof. They asked what sin it represented. It wasn't about whether monsters existed. It was about why. The world, they believed, was a book written by God, and every strange creature was a line of moral poetry. A three-headed calf? Proof that humanity was divided by sin. A frog with wings? A reminder that temptation comes from anywhere, even the swamp. Chroniclers filled entire pages describing monstrous births, believing malformed babies were omens of the apocalypse. One account from 1493 described a child born with a horn and a tail. Another insisted it was just a rumor, but copied it down anyway. Because who wants to be the historian who missed a sign of the end times? Of course, some monsters were suspiciously convenient. When wars broke out, pamphlets appeared describing dragons flying over enemy lands. And when plague struck, people claimed to see half-human demons wandering fields at night. It was PR for divine punishment. Yet, beneath all the fear, there was fascination. Monsters allowed people to imagine the unimaginable, to project their worries into something they could draw, discuss, and safely blame. They made chaos visible, and maybe that made it less terrifying. So as you picture those strange medieval drawings, dragons coiled beside saints, lions holding books, snails fighting knights. Yes, that's real. Remember, the monsters weren't meant to scare. They were there to remind people that even the weirdest horrors have meaning, and that sometimes the best way to face fear is to doodle it. If there's one thing the medieval mind loved almost as much as God, it was math. Terrible math, but math nonetheless. Somewhere around the 12th century, monks began trying to calculate exactly when the world would end. Because apparently, waiting patiently for divine mystery wasn't their strong suit. They used scripture like a spreadsheet. Daniel's 70 weeks, the 7 seals, the 12 tribes. Everything got multiplied, divided, and occasionally added twice, just to be safe. Biblical numerology became a full-time obsession. One scholar in France decided the apocalypse would happen in 1284, based on the dimensions of Noah's Ark and the number of psalms that mentioned fire. Another, in England, predicted the year 1366 because it just felt right. Spoiler, it wasn't. The calculations varied wildly, but the anxiety stayed consistent. Every failed prediction brought both relief and awkward silence. Imagine being the monk who confidently announces the date of Judgment Day, only to wake up the next morning to birds singing and peasants asking if they still needed to pay rent. But these calculations weren't foolishness. They were hope disguised as math. People wanted to know when suffering would end, when justice would arrive, when heaven would finally clock in. And math, even bad math, gave structure to that longing. Some monks even made apocalypse charts, beautifully drawn circles representing cosmic time, with the earth dangling at the edge of eternity like a worried metaphor. They didn't fear the end as much as they feared uncertainty. And when predictions failed, as they always did. The faithful didn't lose hope. They simply adjusted the numbers, convinced they'd misplaced a decimal somewhere in Revelation. There's something tender in that persistence. 1,000 years later, we still do the same thing. We set dates for change, for redemption, for starting fresh next Monday. And when it doesn't happen, we quietly reschedule our apocalypse for later. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture a quiet monastery filled with candlelight. Somewhere, a monk yawns over his parchment, scribbles another number, and whispers, "Maybe next year." And you can almost hear the universe sigh, kindly letting him try again. If the world was going to end, medieval Europe figured it might as well make it a show. From the 12th century onward, towns began performing mystery plays, huge outdoor dramas retelling Bible stories. They were part theater, part sermon, and occasionally, part accident. Crowds packed the town squares, vendors sold roasted nuts, and somewhere backstage, a blacksmith wondered why he'd agreed to play the role of Satan again. The apocalypse plays were the real crowd pleasers. They had everything: angels descending on ropes, demons dragging sinners through trapdoors, and entire choirs blasting trumpets at uncomfortable volume levels. It was basically medieval Broadway, sponsored by Revelation. People loved it and feared it. Actors in devil costumes terrified children. Old women fainted, and dogs barked at the pyrotechnics, which usually involved actual fire. For a few hours, the audience got to see what they'd been hearing about in church. The final judgment, live and unfiltered. Behind the drama was something deeper. The plays weren't meant to entertain. They were meant to prepare. In a world without cinema or doom scrolling, theater was the emotional rehearsal for the end. You watched, you wept, and you went home thinking, maybe I should confess that thing I did with the neighbor's goose. Still, there was joy in the performance. The apocalypse was terrifying, yes, but it was also art. And medieval people, bless them, had a knack for turning existential dread into community bonding. So imagine it, the square filled with candlelight, smoke curling through the night air, actors shouting, trumpets blaring, bells ringing, and the crowd gasping as heaven and hell clash before their eyes. And then, when the play ends, everyone claps politely, goes home and continues sinning exactly as before. Because if there's one constant across the centuries, it's this: humanity loves a good drama about the end of the world, especially when it comes with snacks. Few things could cause medieval panic quite like the sudden disappearance of daylight. Eclipses were rare, unpredictable, and absolutely terrifying. One moment the world was bright and warm. The next, it looked like someone had unplugged creation. Farmers dropped their tools, children cried, and priests sprinted to the nearest bell tower to start ringing repentance at full volume. Because when the sun goes out mid-morning, it's either divine wrath or someone forgot to pay the cosmic electricity bill. To the medieval mind, this wasn't science. It was performance art from God himself. Chroniclers described the sky turning black as sackcloth, the air heavy with dread, and animals acting strangely. Chickens went to bed early, dogs hid, cows refused to moo. Even the local astrologer probably looked up and thought, "Oh, not again." The church tried to calm people down, sort of. Priests told villagers that eclipses were warnings, not punishments. Which sounds comforting until you realize that's like saying, "Don't worry, it's just a preview." But a few brave thinkers started noticing patterns. They tracked the dates, the shadows, the rhythm of the heavens. They realized the darkness wasn't random. It was cyclical, predictable, and utterly magnificent. Still, knowledge didn't stop the fear. Even centuries later, people remembered that eerie stillness. Birds silent, hearts pounding, the horizon glowing like an ember. For those few minutes, the world did end, quietly, gracefully, beautifully. And when the light returned, villagers cheered, kissed the ground, and promised to sin less. It lasted about a week. Eclipses became metaphors in sermons, poems, and songs, symbols of despair followed by divine renewal. They reminded people that even the darkest hour eventually passes, that the sun always stubbornly comes back. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine standing in that medieval field, the world hushed, the sky swallowed by shadow, everyone holding their breath. And then, slowly, golden light returns. The birds sing, the fear fades, and the people look up at the heavens with awe, the same awe you feel now, in the quiet knowing that endings and beginnings are often the same thing. Before social media, before tabloids, before breaking news banners scrolled across glowing screens, there was Agnes from down the street. Medieval gossip was the original mass communication system. And when it came to apocalypse rumors, business was booming. Every village had that one person who knew someone who'd seen the Virgin Mary crying, or a chicken laying an egg with Latin inscriptions. Word spread fast, faster than the plague, and significantly less hygienic. Merchants, pilgrims, and wandering monks carried stories from town to town, embellishing as they went. A comet over one city became a flaming dragon. A minor earthquake somewhere in France became the earth yawned open and almost swallowed the bishop. And since literacy was rare, storytelling was the media. The local blacksmith might double as a broadcaster, the innkeeper a trusted source, and the village drunk, unfortunately, an opinion columnist. It wasn't all nonsense, though. People craved meaning, not mischief. When your world lacked science, explanations, or weather forecasts, gossip was how you processed reality. Rumors filled the gaps where understanding couldn't reach. Even monasteries weren't immune. Monks passed handwritten newsletters, letters of wonders, they called them, detailing floods, plagues, and celestial warnings. Think of it as the medieval version of a viral tweet, except written in ink and sometimes illuminated with gold leaf. Occasionally, official channels got involved. The church would release statements clarifying that, no, the Pope had not turned into an angel of light last Thursday, and no, Judgment Day had not been rescheduled for Lent. Still, people believed what comforted them most, or what scared them best. It's strangely familiar, isn't it? The same heartbeat of curiosity, panic, and awe that drives us today. Different tools, same need, to share, to connect, to say, "Did you hear what happened?" So as you close your eyes, imagine the soft hum of a medieval tavern at night. Voices whispering, ale mugs clinking, fire crackling, and someone leaning in to say, "They say the sky turned red over Paris. Perhaps it's a sign." It always was. Not of the end of the world, but of our endless fascination with stories about it. When life felt uncertain, which, to be fair, was always, medieval people walked. They packed bread, prayers, and questionable footwear, then set off across Europe toward holy sites in search of redemption, miracles, or simply a better view of the apocalypse. Pilgrimages were the original spiritual road trips. Towns buzzed with travelers carrying staffs, badges, and a faint odor of sanctity mixed with sweat. They came from every class: kings and beggars, nuns and knights, farmers and philosophers, all moving in one slow, dusty wave toward somewhere sacred. Jerusalem, Rome, Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury. Each place promised divine grace and maybe a break from whatever plagues were trending that month. But here's the thing. Most pilgrims weren't chasing souvenirs. They were chasing certainty, a feeling that if the world was ending, at least they'd be found walking in the right direction. The journey itself was half the salvation. Roads were dangerous, filled with thieves, wolves, and occasionally overzealous innkeepers. But pilgrims found safety in numbers, singing hymns, sharing food, and swapping apocalyptic rumors like spiritual postcards. They believed that walking purified the soul, step by blistered step. Each prayer whispered along the road was another brick laid toward heaven. Even if they never reached their destination, the motion itself was faith in action, a slow, aching defiance of despair. One chronicler described meeting an old woman walking barefoot to Rome because she dreamt of an angel who told her to keep moving. When asked what she hoped to find, she smiled and said, "The end of my feet or the end of the world, whichever comes first." That was the medieval spirit. Weary, hopeful, a little funny, and somehow unstoppable. And when pilgrims finally arrived, they didn't find answers. They found relics, candles, and silence. But in that silence was peace, the realization that the journey itself had been the point. So as you imagine those long, winding roads stretching under starry skies, think of all the feet that walked them. Not fleeing the end of the world, but walking calmly toward it, singing, praying, laughing. Because even if tomorrow brought apocalypse, tonight still offered a place to rest. If you thought the medieval apocalypse was all about candles and quiet prayers, think again. Some people decided to speed it up. Around the 11th century, a rumor began to spread. The kind of rumor that only needed one good sermon and a few thousand restless nights. Word was that retaking the Holy Land might just trigger the second coming of Christ. Jerusalem, they said, was the key to the end of the world. And wouldn't it be great to unlock it before anyone else did? And so, with that combination of fear, faith, and chronic overconfidence that defines most of human history, the Crusades began. Knights painted crosses on their tunics, kissed their families goodbye, and charged eastward with banners flying and theology somewhat vague. The Pope promised spiritual rewards. Merchants saw opportunity, and everyone agreed it sounded like a divine road trip with a high body count. Marching toward the apocalypse turned out to be less glamorous than advertised. It was hot, confusing, and full of logistics problems. Armies starved, horses died, and more than one crusader realized halfway through that they had no idea where they actually were. Still, the dream persisted, that somewhere beyond the next hill, beyond the next fortress, the final battle between good and evil was waiting. For centuries, preachers spoke of Jerusalem as the hinge of time, the place where history would finally fold shut. Every victory, every siege, every death was another brushstroke in the painting of prophecy. People believed they were living inside Revelation, swords, fire, and blood included. But the end didn't come. Jerusalem fell, rose, fell again, and the stars stayed stubbornly still. The apocalypse, it turned out, didn't want a military escort, yet something enduring remained. The Crusades changed how Europe saw itself, not as a collection of scared villages waiting for the end, but as a continent with purpose, however misguided. It was proof that fear can mobilize as much as it can paralyze, that the line between saving the world and ending it is sometimes drawn in sand. So as you drift off, picture the long caravans of knights, torches flickering, armor clinking softly under the stars, marching through dust and darkness, convinced they were walking toward eternity, but really just deeper into history. Nothing brings people together like a good apocalypse scare, and nothing tears them apart faster than needing someone to blame for it. By the late Middle Ages, fear of the end had become personal. If the world was falling apart, someone had to be at fault, and conveniently, it was always your neighbor. Heretics, witches, Jews, foreigners, anyone who looked different, thought differently, or owned too many cats could find themselves accused of triggering divine wrath. Why did crops fail? Why did the plague return? Why did the cow give sour milk? Clearly, because someone nearby was making pacts with infernal forces. Trials became theater. Villages gathered in squares as trembling suspects confessed to crimes nobody could explain. Flying, shape-shifting, attending mysterious parties in the woods. The church didn't invent the hysteria, but it definitely organized it. Priests led interrogations with the grim efficiency of accountants checking off sins. Behind the madness was something painfully human, the need for control. When the world feels random, it's easier to blame a witch than to admit that fate doesn't take requests. Some inquisitors genuinely believed they were saving souls. Others just liked the power. Torture chambers filled, fires burned, and each execution became both tragedy and warning. A reminder that the apocalypse wasn't just a fear of the future, but something people could inflict right now. And yet, even amid the cruelty, whispers of doubt grew. Writers and scholars began to question whether the devil was really that busy, or whether humanity was just doing his job for him. Compassion flickered quietly, like a candle behind stone walls. The witch hunts and heresy trials eventually faded, leaving behind a scar and a lesson. That panic, left unchecked, always finds someone to punish. That fear, when dressed as righteousness, is still just fear. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine that flickering torchlight in a medieval square, smoke rising, crowds silent, hearts uneasy, and in that silence, hear a whisper, ancient but familiar. Maybe the world isn't ending. Maybe we just need someone to stop acting like it is. Every doomsday prophecy eventually meets its most awkward moment, the morning after. Imagine it. The stars fade, the roosters crow, and everyone who stayed up waiting for fire from heaven just sort of goes to work. It's the medieval equivalent of refreshing your email and realizing God didn't reply. When the world failed to end on schedule, again, Europe collectively blinked, stretched, and tried to pretend it hadn't been holding its breath all night. Monks who'd spent months calculating the date of Judgment Day quietly edited their manuscripts to read a possible sign instead of guaranteed event. Preachers adjusted their sermons to emphasize spiritual apocalypse, which, conveniently, could happen anytime. And ordinary people, the peasants, the merchants, the bakers, they shrugged. Because honestly, they had other problems. The cow still needed milking. The taxes were still due. The sky, though dramatic at times, remained firmly in place. But that anticlimax did something profound. It cracked open the fear that had shadowed Europe for centuries. People realized that maybe the world wouldn't end in fire and trumpets, but in small, quiet ways. A bad harvest here, a lost love there, a candle guttering out in a drafty chapel. And if the big ending kept refusing to arrive, perhaps life itself was the story, not the prelude to something else. Artists began painting hope again. Writers turned their gaze from Revelation's beasts to the beauty of human hearts. Philosophers whispered that maybe paradise wasn't after death, but in kindness, in laughter, in bread shared under a humble roof. The apocalypse had missed its appointment. And in the silence that followed, Europe took a deep breath. When you think about it, that's the best kind of ending. Not one of destruction, but of understanding. The morning after the end of the world, when the sun rises anyway. So, as you picture that soft medieval dawn, dew on fields, bells ringing faintly in the distance, remember, every time the world doesn't end, it begins again. By the late Middle Ages, something shifted. People didn't stop believing the world would end. They just got used to the idea. After centuries of false alarms, the apocalypse became less of a date and more of a mood. It was background music, the quiet hum of eternity reminding everyone to behave, pay their tithes, and maybe apologize to the neighbor whose chicken they borrowed. Instead of panicking, they started playing with the idea. Poets wrote verses about the last sunset being beautiful. Artists painted Judgment Day with almost cheerful precision. Angels smiling, sinners politely descending into fire, everyone looking well lit. Even sermons grew gentler, speaking less of doom and more of mercy. In a strange way, living with the end made people more alive. If everything was temporary, then every meal, every laugh, every candle mattered more. The idea that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed didn't terrify. It motivated. And that's when medieval Europe quietly began to change. Science peeked through the cracks of superstition. Exploration whispered of new worlds instead of the end of this one. And the apocalypse, poor, overworked apocalypse, faded into metaphor. Sure, people still saw omens, still feared plagues, still blamed the occasional comet for their cousin's bad luck. But they also built cathedrals, wrote love songs, and brewed ale strong enough to outlast despair. They didn't stop believing in endings. They just learned to keep living through them. Every season, every storm, every birth and burial was a miniature apocalypse, a tiny death and rebirth of the world. And maybe that's the secret humanity keeps rediscovering. The end of the world isn't one big moment. It's 1,000 small ones, followed by dawn, coffee, and the faint sound of someone hammering a new roof. So as you lie here tonight, listening to the soft creak of your own quiet world, remember, you've already lived through dozens of endings, and somehow you're still here. Which means, just like them, you're already a survivor of the apocalypse, and here we are, at the end of the end. After plagues and prophets, comets and calculations, monsters and monks, the world has once again failed to explode on schedule. Hey guys, thanks for staying awake this long, or for falling asleep somewhere around the comets. Either way, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight, we've traveled through centuries of people convinced they were living on borrowed time. They watched the skies, counted sins, measured stars, and repented at impressive speed. And yet, through every plague, war, and rumor of doom, they kept living. They farmed. They feasted. They fell in love. They had children who told their own stories under the same anxious stars. Maybe that's the real miracle of history. Not that the world keeps spinning, but that we keep finding reasons to spin with it. When medieval Europe feared the end, they prayed louder, loved harder, and built cathedrals tall enough to poke heaven in the ribs. Because deep down, they didn't want the world to end. They wanted it to matter. And it did. Every trembling prayer, every candlelit supper, every awkward sermon about celestial goats, all of it added up to the same truth. We've always been afraid, and we've always carried on anyway. So as you lie here, let the noise of the modern world fade to something medieval. The distant ring of a church bell, the soft wind moving through wheat, the murmur of someone reading by candlelight. The apocalypse can wait. Tonight, there's only peace. Let the stars above you feel ancient again, steady, patient, amused by how many times we've mistaken them for signs of the end. Let the world feel small, safe, and warm, because it is. Take a slow breath. The same air that once filled the lungs of terrified peasants, hopeful pilgrims, and laughing knights fills yours now. And just like them, you'll wake tomorrow to another sunrise that wasn't supposed to happen. So good night, traveler. Rest easy. The world's still here, and it's waiting for you in the morning.